Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. In New York high society, few people were unaware of the name Richard Belmont. Heir to a colossal fortune and chairman of several successful companies, he ruled the financial world with both power and arrogance. His mansions, cars, and high society parties were the visible symbols of his power. Yet, behind this luxurious facade, Richard cultivated a much darker vice: contempt for others. The dinners he organized in his home in Greenwood Hills were not mere receptions. They resembled cruel theaters where Richard placed himself as director of refined humiliations. Under his crystal chandeliers and velvet curtains, he always chose a victim to ridicule to entertain his guests. These latter, rich bankers, heiresses and prestigious lawyers, laughed complacently, feeling reinforced in their own superiority. One autumn evening, as the wind swept through the gardens of his estate, Richard made a proposal that would change the course of his life. Sitting in his living room, a glass of cognac in hand, he said to his friends, "We've already laughed at politicians, ambitious young people, and even a failed writer. But this time, I have an even tastier idea." Everyone turned to him curiously. Victoria Hayes, a haughty heiress, frowned her perfectly shaped eyebrows. William Carter, an influential banker, put his cigar in the ashtray, intrigued. Richard smirked. "The other day I met a cleaning lady in one of my buildings. A black woman, modest, insignificant. Imagine inviting her here, to dine with us. She would be lost in front of our crystal, our rare wines, our conversations. The spectacle would be exquisite." A burst of cruel laughter rippled through the room. Victoria, stroking her diamonds, added, "What a brilliant idea. Seeing a maid trying to behave at our table. What a distraction." William Carter, for his part, smiled wryly. "Belmont, you always surpass your imagination." The name of the woman Richard had in mind was Amara Johnson, a discreet 40-year-old woman who worked as a cleaner in several Manhattan offices. To him, she represented the very symbol of modesty he despised. What he didn't know was that Amara was no ordinary woman. Beneath her simple uniform and precise gestures lay a story of unsuspected depth. A story of dignity, resilience, and pride inherited from generations that had never let themselves be broken. This dinner, intended to be nothing more than a cruel farce, would become much more than a social gathering. It would be a confrontation between the arrogance of the powerful and the quiet grandeur of a woman no one expected. And when the doors of the manor opened that evening, guests would discover not a shy maid, but a queen. Belmont Manor, perched on the verdant heights of Greenwood Hills, was lit like a palace tonight. Through the immense bay windows, golden glows could be seen reflecting off the perfectly manicured gardens and marble sculptures imported from Italy. Every detail exuded the opulence and ostentatious taste of Richard Belmont. Inside, the atmosphere was saturated with refined perfumes and worldly conversation. Crystal and china mingled with the pretentious laughter of a dozen hand-picked guests. Champagne glasses clinked with a delicate clink, but beneath this elegance lurked a far darker cruelty. Richard Belmont sat in his leather armchair by the fireplace, surveying his guests with the confidence of a sovereign among his courtiers. Tall, with carefully combed salt and pepper hair, and dressed in a tailored suit, he embodied the very image of the untouchable rich. But what was most striking about him was not his appearance, but the cold smile that never left his lips as he prepared for another humiliation. "My friends," he said, raising his glass of cognac slightly, "tonight I have an idea that will surpass all our previous evenings." A knowing silence fell immediately. His guests knew he was always up to something unusual. Victoria Hayes, a young heiress of icy beauty, put down her glass of wine and crossed her legs with studied elegance. "We're listening, Richard. What have you come up with now?" To his left, William Carter, the influential banker, in his 40s and smoking a cigar, let out a low, deep laugh. "I hope this is more entertaining than that poor writer you destroyed last time. He was lost for words in front of you." Richard gave a predatory smile. "Precisely, what I am proposing to you this time has nothing to do with words. Rather, imagine a contrast. The most brutal of contrasts. Thomas Whitaker, a worldly lawyer known for his sharp tongue, leaned forward slightly. You've piqued our curiosity. Tell us everything. Richard took the time to savor a sip of cognac before continuing. In one of my buildings, I recently met a cleaning lady. A black woman, humble, insignificant. Her name is Amara Johnson. Nothing special to say about her, except that she has absolutely no business being in a place like this. A burst of laughter erupted from Victoria, who raised her hand to her diamond necklace as if to emphasize her point. Richard. You're not seriously thinking about it? Inviting him to your table? Precisely, he replied with icy satisfaction. Imagine the scene, her awkward manner around our silverware, her silences lost in our refined conversations. She would be the center of attention. And we would have an unforgettable memory. William Carter shook his head, laughing. Belmont, you are truly evil. Thomas Whitaker added in a honeyed voice. This will be a unique entertainment. A maid in our midst. What irony. The guests laughed heartily, already amused at the thought of the scene to come. Richard, satisfied, leaned back in his chair, a glint of cruelty in his eyes. What he didn't know, what none of them imagined, was that the play they had just staged wouldn't play out as they had planned. For in the shadow of their mocking laughter, Amara Johnson was about to enter their world, not as a victim, but as a revelation. The next morning, in the heart of Harlem, a vibrant neighborhood but still marked by inequalities, Amara Johnson was finishing her cleaning shift at an insurance office. Her movements were precise, methodical, almost elegant. She wore her simple uniform, a gray shirt and black pants, but despite this modest attire, there was an allure about her that no clothing could hide. Amara was in her 40s, with deep brown skin, and her hair, neatly tied in a bun, framed a dignified face. Her eyes, an intense black, reflected a quiet strength. Many had seen her pass by, broom or mop in hand, but few knew who she really was. As she was packing her things into her worn bag, a courier entered the building carrying a package. Madam Amara Johnson? He asked. Surprised, she stepped forward. Yes, it's me. The young man handed him a cream envelope, sealed with wax with the initials R.B.in relief. Intrigued, she thanked him politely and waited until she was alone to open the letter. Inside, words carefully calligraphed on luxurious paper. Madam Johnson. Mr. Richard Belmont, owner of the buildings where you work, personally invites you to a gala dinner at his residence in Greenwood Hills this Saturday evening. Evening dress required. Your presence is eagerly awaited. Sincerely. Mr. Belmont's private secretary. Amara stood there, holding the paper in her hands. Her first instinct was suspicion. She knew Richard Belmont's reputation, arrogant, cruel, and accustomed to mocking those he deemed inferior. Why invite her, a cleaning lady, to a party like this? She folded the letter carefully, then slipped it into her bag. Her friend and colleague, Lydia Brown, joined her at the exit. You look troubled, Amara. What is this envelope? Amara hesitated, then showed it to Lydia. After reading it, her eyes widened. Don't you think so? This is a joke, Amara. You know very well that these people aren't inviting our people to honor us. They want to amuse themselves at your expense. Amara looked down for a moment, thinking. Then she slowly raised her head, a new sparkle in her eyes. Perhaps. But sometimes, Lydia, destiny hides behind the humiliations we are subjected to. What if this dinner was the opportunity to show them who I really am? Lydia shook her head, worried. You're playing with fire. Amara smiled slightly. I'm not afraid of fire. I've survived it before. She spoke like a connoisseur. Her past was marked by trials few would have endured. She had known extreme poverty, loss, contempt, but she had emerged with her dignity intact and an intelligence cultivated in the silence of public libraries where she had educated herself alone, late at night. This dinner wasn't a casual invitation. It was a challenge. And Amara had already made up her mind. Night was falling on Harlem, and Amara was walking home, her letter carefully tucked into her bag. As she crossed the busy streets, she observed the local shops, the children still playing ball despite the darkness, the old people sitting on the steps chatting. This was her neighborhood, her refuge, but also the witness to all her battles. Her apartment, located in a modest red brick building, was simple but impeccably kept. Every piece of furniture had a story to tell. A small bookcase, full of second-hand books, betrayed a quiet passion for reading. On the living room table, a framed photograph depicted a young woman in a black academic gown and square hat. It was Amara, more than 20 years earlier. Few knew that she had once walked the podium of a prestigious university. Born in Atlanta, in a poor but dignified family, Amara had always been a brilliant student. Her teachers saw in her a rare light, a determination to break the invisible chains that society placed around her. Thanks to scholarships and hard work, she had entered Columbia University in New York, where she specialized in English literature and history. But life, cruel and unpredictable, had shattered her dreams. Her father died in a construction site accident, and her mother, weakened by illness, passed away shortly after. Amara had to interrupt her studies to support her two younger brothers. She then took the most menial jobs, waitress, assistant, then housekeeper. Every sacrifice she made, she did so without bitterness, with a quiet strength. Her brothers, today, had become responsible and grateful men, but Amara, for her part, had never ceased to carry the weight of the choice she had made. Yet she hadn't given up on who she really was. In the evenings, after her cleaning hours, she still read Shakespeare, Toni Morrison, or James Baldwin. She wrote in a diary profound reflections on society, on human dignity, on injustice. Where others saw a cleaning lady, there was in truth an educated, cultured woman, endowed with rare wisdom. That evening, sitting at her table, she reread Richard Belmont's letter. Her fingers brushed the luxurious paper, and she thought of all those wealthy men and women who saw her as a shadow, an invisible presence. "You think you're inviting me to ridicule me," she whispered to herself, "but you don't know that I carry within me the legacy of forgotten queens, the voice of my ancestors, and the dignity that money can never buy." A flame ignited in her heart. This dinner was no longer a threat, but a scene. A scene where she would finally reveal what she had always hidden. Belmont Manor, a vast mansion of marble and glass, was gradually transforming into a theater of pride. In the kitchens, chefs busied themselves, chopping, simmering, and arranging with military precision the most refined dishes: caviar, lobster, foie gras, vintage wines. The servants, dressed in impeccable black uniforms, moved silently, like well-trained shadows. At the center of everything, Richard Belmont supervised with almost manic attention. Nothing escaped his critical gaze. He ordered the chandeliers to be even more brilliant, the napkins to be folded with a perfect crease, the table to be decorated with white orchids specially imported from Singapore. This dinner was to be grand, and for him, Amara's humiliation would be the finishing touch. In his office, surrounded by his closest guests who were helping him polish his show, he laughed heartily. "My friends, prepare yourselves for an unforgettable moment," he said with that cruel smile. "Tonight, a woman who has never touched a crystal glass will clumsily hold our cutlery. I want to see her eyes lost in the presence of our wines, her words hesitant in the middle of our conversations." Victoria Hayes, lying on an armchair, said contemptuously, "Let's hope she at least understands how to use a fork." William Carter added laughingly, "If not, she can always teach us how to mop the floor." Laughter erupted, filling the room with a suffocating arrogance. To them, this dinner was nothing but a cruel game. Meanwhile, several miles away, in his small Harlem apartment, Amara Johnson was preparing too. But her preparations were nothing like those at Belmont. She had no servants, no precious jewels, no haute couture gowns. In front of her mirror, she opened a box carefully stored under her bed. Inside lay a long, deep midnight blue dress, inherited from her mother. Understated, elegant, and timeless, surpassing trends. Amara gently took it out, stroked the fabric reverently, then put it on. In the mirror, her reflection changed immediately. She no longer looked like the housekeeper everyone saw every day. She looked like a forgotten sovereign who had just regained her throne. She completed her outfit with small pearl earrings, the only piece of jewelry her father had given her before his death. No gold, no diamonds. Just simplicity and history. Her hair, tied in a low bun, highlighted her noble bearing. Before leaving, she opened her diary, wrote a sentence in it, then closed it. Dignity is not begged for, it is embodied. In his illuminated mansion, Richard Belmont smiled as he imagined the grotesque scene he was about to offer his guests. In her modest apartment, Amara Johnson smiled too, but with a different smile, that of a woman ready to face contempt with the silent power of her truth. Two worlds were about to collide. And nothing would go as planned. Evening had fallen on Greenwood Hills, and the Belmont Manor shone brightly. The long, silent black limousine glided down the cobblestone driveway, attracting the gaze of the guests already gathered in the lobby. Inside, Amara Johnson stood straight, her face serene, her midnight blue dress falling elegantly around her figure. The tinted windows hid her determination from prying eyes, but her gaze was fixed on the mansion's imposing front door. She knew what awaited her: hushed laughter, contemptuous whispers, perhaps even mocking glances. But she had decided not to play the role Richard Belmont had imagined for her. When the door finally opened, a light breeze stirred the fabric of her dress, and the light from the chandeliers reflected on her bright eyes. An almost religious silence fell in the hall. The guests, prepared for a scene of ridicule, were struck by what they saw. Amara was no maid. She was a sovereign, a queen in her dignity and presence. Her carriage was noble, her shoulders straight, her hands delicate and assured. Whispers began to circulate among the guests. "Who is she?" Victoria Hayes whispered, mouth agape. She is sublime," stammered Thomas Whittaker, unable to hide his astonishment. Richard Belmont, in the center of the room, felt a shudder run through him. He had planned to humiliate her, to see her stumble in her heels, to blush with embarrassment in front of high society. But what he saw now unsettled him. His cruel smile wavered, replaced by a mixture of disbelief and unease. Amara moved forward, each step measured, without a word. Her gaze swept over the guests, but lingered on no one in particular. She wasn't seeking approval or fear, she simply imposed her presence, her dignity, and that was enough to captivate the room. Richard tried to regain control of the situation. "Mrs. Johnson, welcome," he said in a voice that was meant to be confident but slightly shaky. "We are delighted to welcome you." Amara gave him a polite, distant smile and replied, "Thank you for the invitation, Mr. Belmont." The contrast was striking, she, calm and majestic, he, nervous, trying to mask his confusion. The guests, for their part, watched in silence, some fascinated, others frustrated by the obvious: Belmont's trap had just turned against him. Amara took a few more steps and headed toward the center of the hall, where a red carpet had been laid to showcase her, according to Richard's cruel plan. But now, this carpet was no longer a stage for ridicule. It was a catwalk where she embodied the grandeur, dignity, and silent authority that had just imposed itself on the room. That night at Belmont Manor, the rules had changed. The maid was no longer the one being mocked. She had become the queen of the evening. The lobby of Belmont Manor, usually filled with laughter and social conversation, was now filled with an electric silence. The guests, prepared for a spectacle of ridicule, were frozen in front of it. Amara Johnson, his presence commanded respect. Every movement, every gesture, exuded confidence and self-control. Victoria Hayes, who just minutes before had been sneering at the thought of humiliating her, stepped back slightly, her diamond necklace almost trembling in her hand. She glanced at William Carter, who, too, was unable to hide his surprise. She has nothing in common," he murmurs. Thomas Whittaker, accustomed to judging and dominating, felt his confidence waver. Words escaped him, and he realized that he wasn't the one in command tonight. Richard Belmont, in the center of the room, felt his control slipping through his fingers. The cruel smile that had always been his armor was flickering, replaced by a dull tension. Every glance from the guests, every silent whisper, seemed to conspire against him. he tried to regain control of the situation. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Amara Johnson. But even her voice, intended to be firm, betrayed her unease. Amara, for her part, looked at him with majestic neutrality. She wasn't laughing, wasn't trembling. She wasn't seeking confrontation or approval. Her only weapon was her presence, and she wielded it with perfection. As dinner began, the whispers turned to hushed conversations. The guests exchanged incredulous glances. How could a woman from a modest background command such authority in a world of privilege? Richard tried to hide his confusion behind a forced smile, but Amara didn't need to do anything. Every movement, every glance, every controlled hand gesture was enough to upset the balance of the evening. Her eyes, deep and calm, captured those of the guests with such intensity that they couldn't look away. A strange feeling gripped the guests, admiration mixed with unease. The woman they had wanted to ridicule was becoming the central element of the evening, and Richard finally understood, he was no longer the master of the game. Amara sat gracefully, every movement studied, every gesture precise. The guests, captivated, realized they were witnessing a silent but masterful lesson: dignity is not measured by wealth, and true greatness cannot be faked. Richard, for his part, felt his pride waver for the first time. He understood, deep down, that this evening he had designed to humiliate her was becoming the scene of his own silent but inevitable humiliation. Dinner was in full swing at Belmont Manor. The guests, still reeling from Amara's regal arrival, tried to maintain an appearance of normalcy. Servers circulated with refined dishes, but the whispers and furtive glances continued to increase. Richard Belmont, still seated at the head of the table, felt his control slipping away. Amara, however, remained calm and silent, observing everyone's reactions. Then, when a silence fell between the conversations, she leaned slightly toward Richard and spoke, her voice soft but firm. "Mr. Belmont, thank you for the invitation. Allow me to say that I am honored, although I suspect your intentions were not exactly those of a genuine welcome." A faint nervous laugh rippled through the table, but the clarity and control of his tone silenced all the mockery. Richard felt a shiver of worry. "And what do you mean by that?" he asked, trying to hide his nervousness behind a tight smile. Amara smiled softly, almost mysteriously. "I'm just not here to be judged by my clothes or my social standing. I'm here to be myself." The guests exchanged astonished glances. Some were fascinated by his calm and poise. Others, like Victoria Hayes, bit their lips, feeling that their arrogance had just encountered an insurmountable wall. Amara continued, looking at each person at the table, imposing silence. "You can mock what you believe to be inferior. But a person's worth is not measured by their wealth or their appearance. It is measured by their strength, their resilience, their dignity, and how they rise above adversity." At that moment, even Richard Belmont felt unsettled. Amara's words, calm and powerful, echoed through the room like an unexpected echo. "And to be honest," she continued, "it is sad to see that some of us think that the ridicule of others is entertainment. But it is even sadder to see rich and influential people forget what true greatness is." A complete silence fell. The guests no longer dared to speak, absorbed in this unexpected lesson. Richard, however, felt unable to respond. He realized with horror that the dinner he had designed to humiliate Amara had turned into a public lesson in his own arrogance. Amara leaned slightly across the table and concluded with a gentleness that was as imposing as her authority. "Tonight, I am not here to impress you. I am here to remind you of a truth you seem to have forgotten: respect and dignity cannot be bought." At these words, some guests, touched and impressed, exchanged admiring glances with Amara. Others, their pride stung, remained silent, unable to react. And Richard Belmont understood, for the first time, that his plan had completely backfired. The silence around the table was almost palpable. Each guest held their breath, captivated by Amara's quiet strength. Richard Belmont, still at the head of the table, felt his pride crumble with every word spoken. But what no one knew yet was that this was only the beginning of the lesson. Amara stood up gently, letting the fabric of her dress fall gracefully, and walked to the center of the hall. The guests, intrigued, followed her with their eyes. She stopped and, for the first time, her gaze fell directly on Richard. Belmont, she said calmly, you seem to think that my presence here is a coincidence, a curiosity for your amusement. Allow me to enlighten you. She took a deep breath and continued. Before I became a housekeeper, I was a student at Columbia University. I studied literature, history, and philosophy. I worked hard to build a future for myself, but life imposed other paths on me. Murmurs rippled through the room. Some guests exchanged incredulous glances. Victoria Hayes frowned, unable to hide her surprise. I have never forgotten my roots or my ambitions, Amara continued, and what you consider inferior status has never defined my worth. I have spent my life learning, fighting for my dignity, and raising my brothers to the same high standards. Richard felt a lump in his throat. He had imagined this woman as weak and ridiculous, but now she embodied everything he had never understood: quiet strength, resilience, and true greatness. Amara took another step, her gaze sweeping the room. And just so you understand better, I'm not just a housekeeper. I also run a support network for disadvantaged youth in Harlem. I fund scholarships for those who want to study and succeed. What you think is a humble job is, for me, a way to create a real and lasting impact. At this point, several guests slowly rose to applaud, impressed by Amara's poise and intelligence. Some, who had planned to laugh at her, were now plunged into silent shame. Richard, for his part, felt crushed by the weight of the truth. His plan of ridicule had turned into a revelation of his own limitations and weaknesses. His voice, when he tried to speak, was choked with emotion and surprise. That's impressive," he stammered. Amara smiled at him softly, without arrogance, but with a clarity that hurt. "You wanted to demean me for your entertainment, Mr. Belmont. Tonight, you're the one being laid bare." The entire mansion now vibrated with this reverse tension. The woman he had wanted to humiliate had just reversed the order of things, and Richard Belmont finally understood that he had just lost control of his own evening. Belmont Manor, usually a place of arrogance and ostentation, was now the scene of an unexpected revelation. The guests, fascinated, kept watching Amara Johnson, whose presence and words had reversed the entire dynamic of the evening. Richard Belmont, on the other hand, stood frozen in his place, unable to react. Every attempt to smile or regain control ended in failure. His guests, who usually admired him for his wealth and power, now saw their master in a new light, vulnerable, human, and above all, beaten by a woman they had once believed to be insignificant. Amara, aware of the effect she was making, walked towards him calmly. Her words were calm, precise, and carried an authority that money cannot buy. "Mr. Belmont, I respect your position and your achievements. But tonight, you tried to reduce me to a curiosity, to an amusement." Richard opened his mouth, searching for a word, but none came. His guests held their breath, waiting to see how he would extricate himself from this trap. But there was no escape. Amara continues. "The humiliation you thought you were orchestrating gave me the opportunity to show who I really am. And in doing so, it revealed something unexpected, that true greatness lies not in wealth or power, but in dignity, courage, and inner strength." A profound silence fell. Every guest understood that Richard's cruel plan had backfired. Murmurs of surprise and admiration now circulated among them. Even Victoria Hayes, once sure of his contempt, looked away in embarrassment. Amara took a step back, letting her gaze sweep the room, then leaned slightly toward Richard. "Tonight you learned a lesson that money can't buy: never underestimate someone because of their circumstances or background." At that moment, Richard felt his pride crack. The laughter he had imagined to humiliate Amara was now murmurs of admiration for her, and every guest offered a silent apology for participating in what they thought was a mockery. For the first time in his life, Richard Belmont was exposed. His wealth, his power, his arrogant manner were useless against Amara's quiet, implacable strength. He realized, with profound humiliation, that he had just lost this social and moral battle. The evening, which was supposed to be his triumph, had turned into a masterclass. And in that mansion glittering with wealth, a simple but universal truth became clear: true power lies not in money, but in dignity and courage. The dinner was drawing to a close. The guests, still reeling from Amara Johnson's revelation and presence, were slowly rising, some to applaud timidly, others to exchange admiring and knowing glances. The atmosphere, which had begun as one of contempt and mockery, was now filled with respect and fascination. Amara stood in the center of the hall, tall and majestic, exuding dignity and absolute calm. Her gaze swept the room, not to dominate, but to silently thank those who, through their attention, finally recognized her worth. Every smile, every admiring silence, was a tribute to her strength and resilience. Richard Belmont stood by the fireplace, motionless, unable to look away. His cruel plan had failed, and he finally understood that no amount of wealth could erase the truth. The humiliation he had imagined for Amara had backfired, and she had triumphed with her mere presence and voice. He felt, for the first time, a mixture of humility and respect. Amara took a few steps toward the exit, her elegant coat draped over her shoulders. The guests, fascinated, could only follow her with their gaze. She didn't try to impress anyone further, she had already won the silent battle for everyone's hearts and minds. Before going through the door, she turned one last time to Richard. "Tonight you have learned a lesson that I hope will stay with you for a long time. Respect and greatness are not measured by wealth or power, but by dignity, inner strength, and humanity." Then, with a simple but regal gesture, she left the manor. The cool night wind caressed her face, and the starlight seemed to outline her silhouette, as if to mark her triumph. The guests remained silent, some still moved, others pondering their own arrogance. Richard, however, remained frozen, a new feeling in his chest, recognition of his own error and sincere admiration for the one he had thought he wanted to humiliate. That night in Belmont Manor, one truth became clear: wealth and power may impress, but dignity, intelligence, and fortitude command respect. And in this world of pomp and pretense, Amara Johnson had reigned like a queen, silent but unwavering. The mansion, once filled with luxury, now seemed more humble, as if it had understood that a true presence could surpass any opulence. Amara moved away, but her passing left an indelible mark, that of quiet strength, greatness of spirit and sovereignty of soul.